So thank you, Michael, and thanks also without doubt, superlative thanks to Professor Bullman for this outstanding organization, bringing together this rare group of thinking practitioners and practicing thinkers to discuss over the past days matters of utter urgency and promise. Over the past couple of months, the themes that weave together my title have assumed different figurations, one of which informed the abstract of the talk, and another which you might find yourself more familiar with after its delivery. It might not be the same as the one I intended. This is good. Moreover, I see my talk as cutting across in an oblique and transversal manner a certain thematic of the notion of reality that has emerged in the past 2 days. This is also good. As an entry point, then, I've chosen a strange notion that emerges in Freud's late work, a notion which will be here resignified, namely the reality principle. Reality is for Freud the counterpoint of pleasure, the two principles antagonizing each other over the governance of the soul. Fearing its Dionysian resolution, under the sway of unbounded, untrammeled pleasure, the ego's instincts of self-preservation lead to the adoption of the reality principle. Pleasure is not abandoned, but rather deferred, apportioned, and meted out in ways that if they fail to procure more pleasure, they ensure, at the very least, the survival of the self, and thus the possibility of the continuation of pleasure. Accordingly, the reality principle dictates the exchange of the direct with the indirect, the short with the long, the present with the future. The reality principle presents a claim of superiority rather than opposition to the pleasure principle. It unfolds the latter, economizes it by amortizing its expenditure. Reality for Freud is meta-pleasure. My intention is not merely to think together in the reality principle, as Derrida proposes, the economical and uneconomical circuits of pleasure, which is certainly a necessary propedeutic, but to designate a different uneconomic function at the heart of the reality principle, one that does not come from the de facto loss of future enjoyment that every present enjoyment necessitates. Rather, reality presents itself from the outset as a challenge to pleasure, antagonizing anew what it unfolds. Confronted with a choice between reality and pleasure, one appears strangely attached to the former. And insofar as reality is aligned with truth, an alignment that we would have to pause in order to disarticulate, the red pill will always win over the blue. It is not an empirical preference, it is not a judgment of taste, it is an a priori condition of existence. Reality overpowers pleasure and pain. At least, this is how we think, how we wish to think, how we are conditioned to think. Welcome to the desert of the real. Baudrillard's invitation consigns the reality principle to a historical contingency. Reality was, but is no longer. A desert stretches along reality's erstwhile domain. Whereas the imaginary used to be the alibi, literally the elsewhere of the real is now the alibi of the model, except that this alibi is nowhere. Not a utopia to come, but one irrevocably lost. What could have possibly effected this hemorrhage of the real into disappearance? Perhaps even more importantly, how could something like that have happened? And in fact, what did exactly transpire? The eclipse of the sovereign difference between reality and its simulacrum announced the end of both elements of the relation. When the mirror that sustained the reality differential shattered, the real lost itself along with its reflection. The tacit assumption of this constitutive diagnosis being that without the mirror, and thus without its reflected visions, the real can no longer recognize itself as such. And further decisively, that for the phenomenon of the real, this as such constituted its very essence. Without having its reality constantly underwritten by the distance of the simulacrum, the real could no longer appear as such. It thus became nothing. Indistinct from its simulacrum, the real was no longer any more significant than the latter, both at once reduced to a radical insignificance. One possible path of questioning Baudrillard's undertaking is to exert pressure on what constitutes the distinctive trait of what used to be called postmodern, a term that rings increasingly hollower. And Baudrillard might contend this is because we no longer confront the passage to the postmodern, but have thoroughly immersed ourselves in it. Perhaps, in a less contentious manner, we might ask, what is the distinctiveness of the present, his, ours, or even perhaps of the present to come? One of Baudrillard's answers: it is now impossible to isolate the process of the real or to prove the real. Yet, was it ever? Baudrillard considers the expansiveness of the horizon of the universe effected by space conquest as one of the vectors along which the internal coherence of reality is contested. Yet this contestation took place already with the telescope, if not with the first cosmogony, which fabulated and thus destabilized the matrix of the real. It is not a matter of finding precedents. It is a matter of understanding a transformation announced as already effected almost 4 decades ago. Certainly something has taken place, something that continues to unravel. It is something that a sentence or a book cannot account for, something that the unprecedented processing power of artificial intelligence articulates in absentia, a colossal calculation that resists all translation. Baudrillard attempted this translation before the devastating onset of artificial intelligence, at the dawn of the digital. At the time, he already saw that the thrill of advertising had been displaced onto computers and onto the miniaturization of everyday life by computer science. The thrill being nothing less than the alluring outdoors of the imaginary. But these outdoors have been shut off for us. Simulation is insuperable, unsurpassable, dull and flat, without exteriority. We will no longer even pass through to the other side of the mirror. That was still the golden age of transcendence, pronounces Baudrillard. In this totality without dehors, the techno-scientific medial apparatus has absorbed everything, leaving no remainder, and by the same token, turning the totality itself into an absolute remainder. Yet a crack appears. Baudrillard, against all possible miscomprehensions, nowhere denounces the real as an illusion which has at long last been abolished. Its status as a historical contingency does not reduce it to mere fiction. Made is not made up, in Donna Haraway's superlative concision. Rather, the making and unmaking of the contingency of the real is what interests Baudrillard as the specific event that we witness unfolding. This unfolding eliminates, as we saw, the sovereign difference of the real and its simulacrum. It does this by ever approximating degrees of similitude. Since, however, the more the simulacrum approximates the simulated, the more its character as a simulacrum becomes apparent. And a race of escalation of outdoing reality ensues. The real tries to outrun its shadow. It soon becomes clear that only what is more real than the real can constitute a sufficient simulation. Thereby, the real is supplanted by the hyperreal. The hyperreal dominates the real by continuously adding dimensions of similitude, hyper-exacting the exactitude of the real. In turn, the real emerges as a leftover of truth, its sole virtue not to have entered this struggle of exactitude and similitude, not to have entered the race of escalation. This leftover is the residue of the real, the unsimulated and thus unassimilated, which attests to the obscene dialectic through which the hyperreal has exiled the real from its domain. And since, as Baudrillard says, all of the real is residual, and everything that is residual is destined to repeat itself indefinitely in phantasms, the vanquished real is destined to haunt the hyperreal. It does, in fact, so incessantly, and yet it is in the errors and the anomalies, in the collapse of its exactitude, that the matrix reveals its constitutive spectrality. The glitch of the hyperreal allows us to diagnose the extent and intensity of contemporary nihilism, a nihilism of transparency. For Baudrillard, the latter consists no longer in the death of God, but in his becoming hyperreal. A perplexing development which invites the same incredulity on the status of the novelty. After all, God was always hyperreal. Ens realissimum, the most real of all things real. And let us recall that it is Platonist and Platonizing theologies that introduce into language the prefix hyper, which in Latin will be translated as super. Yet something is different. As supremely real, both the Platonic one and the Trinitarian God are still real, to the extent that this category is still signifying, of course. It is man, and in a sense all creation, that exists as imago Dei. Man is the simulacrum, the hologram. God's hyperreality is the first reality. His shadow, or mirror reflection, notwithstanding the Gnostic resonances here, is the world. So, after God's death, the world, having assumed his place as the epicenter of the real, it technologically reproduced itself, perfecting its reproduction until the latter became more real than its model. Man crafted the hyperreal hologram, then the hologram became God. The nihilism of transparency descended. Words such as cynicism and pessimism, aside of the facile disconnection from the connotative history, their connotative history, are irrelevant to Baudrillard's project. Nihilism is a historical moment, one that has redoubled itself, first with Nietzsche as the tragedy of the anthropological murder of God, now as the farce of a hologrammatic Prometheus. But this farcical nihilism loses none of its ethereal gravity or its devastating non-violence for it. In the meanwhile, millions are crushed. And yet, simulacra and simulation opens with the announcement of a double loss. The real will no longer be able to produce itself as death, unvanquished, seems to vanish. So the real will no longer be able to produce itself as death, unvanquished, seems to vanish. The relation of the real and death is the contested nexus, the correspondence out of which we might gain a passage to both the death of the real and the reality of death. Tarrying with Baudrillard's diagnosis, the eclipse of death by means of its simulation represents the desperate attempt of institutionalized powers to escape their real death throes. The apparatus craves for anyone prepared to sacrifice his life or thus offer his death through a revolutionary practice. But no revolutionary practice seems to afford the prospect of a meaningful death in liberal democracies, and no one seems to be willing or able to die. The apparatus of power seems thus to attempt two simultaneous moves. On the one hand, it hopes and strives for real death. On the other, it attempts to make us stakeholders in its project of simulating death away. With regard to the former, the apparatus has understood its need of reality in order to signify and sustain its excess production of simulacra, its last resort being the final remains of life and death. Thus, for example, reality television, already a staple at the time of simulacra and simulation, stages a feast of those without a life, and thus without death, on the life of those passive protagonists who, without either presenting or representing themselves, deliver themselves over to the televised mass sacrificial spectacle. The reality of simulation is unbearable, tells us Baudrillard. Crueler than Artaud's theatre of cruelty, which was still an attempt to create a dramaturgy of life, the last gasp of an ideality of the body, of blood, of violence in a system that was already taking it away. This vampirism of capitalism, with which Marx was well acquainted, passes here through the litmus test of reality. Life and death have no value for hyperreality unless they can be exchanged for a modicum of precious reality. Thus, for example, it becomes clear that the precautionary warning such as that of Guattari comes too late. When we hear almost a decade after the simulacra and simulation that a society that fails to use tolerance and permanent inventiveness to imaginarize violence in its various manifestations runs the risk of seeing violence crystallize in the real, we know that the reversal of this relation has already taken effect. By making all violence imaginary, by placing all violence at the level of simulation, hyperreality has vanquished reality. So it is for Baudrillard that both the apparatus and we, trapped in its machinations, crave for the real catastrophe to arrive, taking obscene pleasure in environmental disasters as compassionate acts of a forgotten, twice dead God. We welcome the infinite peril of the Anthropocene as a last exit from the simulation. In a state of total implosion, we hope for something that can still explode. Finding ourselves in the same ennui as the namesake protagonist of Janacek's opera, The Makropoulos Affair, her words, weary of immortality, ring truer in our ears. Dying or living, it's all one. It's all the same thing. In me, life has come to a standstill. I cannot go on. In the end, it's the same, singing and silence. Wishing to be rattled out of the apathy of simulation, we are ready to exchange simulated immortality for a real death. The reality principle calls out for death, if only the choice of reality was a real choice. But within the ground simulation, we have achieved an immortality which, for the most part, consists in an incapacity to confront death. In the matrix, there is neither subject nor death, nor unconscious, nor repression, since nothing stops the enchainment of forms. Without unconscious, man is reduced to an animal, with the difference that an animal has a territory. And since men lost their territories first, and in turn lost what constitutes the territorial ersatz, namely their unconscious, all that is left is a nostalgia of becoming animal, which, for Baudrillard, contra de lèse-en-Guattari, amounts to the hope of reclaiming a territory, perhaps a territory on which to die. And here you might recall Tolstoy's How Much Land Does a Man Need? Hyperreality structures immortality as a simultaneity of all the functions without a past, without a future, and operationality on every level. But let us not be fooled. It is the hyperreal self that is immortal and thus commands systemic allegiance, while the real self, deterred until death and ultimately deterred altogether from a meaningful death, is already dead. Thus the human's two bodies experience an utter disarticulation. The real body continues to suffer the inglorious, slow demise of a sedentary existence, while the impervious hyperreal body expends infinite energies as long as it is able to maintain its lifeline to the real body, which now appears as little more than the burden of a temporary compromise. The promise takes a series of forms. Holograms, clones, ultimately the digital upload, assure us that a future without the prison of the body is possible. The soma sema of the Pythagoreans and Platonists, the body that was a grave, at last overcome, leaving behind in obsolescence even the most quixotic transhuman dreams. Will the digital hyperreal self still conform to the rule of the double? Although Baudrillard expends significant efforts analyzing the hologram and the clone, he also declares, today the simulacrum no longer goes by way of the double and of duplication, but by way of genetic miniaturization. As we saw, another miniaturization, that of computers, is unfolding at the same time. The digital and the genetic are thus here two sides of a single coin, circulating in a singular economy. A lot needs to be examined. It is indeed important to start with the double one sees in the mirror and the one that persists once the mirror is shattered. We read with Baudrillard, cloning also retains nothing, and for the same reason of the immemorial and narcissistic dream of the subject's projection into his ideal alter ego, since this projection still passes through an image, the one in the mirror in which the subject is alienated in order to find himself again, or the one, seductive and mortal, in which the subject sees himself in order to die there. None of this occurs in cloning. No more medium, no more image, any more than an industrial object is the mirror of the identical one that succeeds it in the series. One is never the ideal or mortal image of the other. They can only be added to each other. And if they can only be added, it means that they are not sexually engendered and know nothing of death. In these lines, the presence of Freud, whom we left early by the wayside, is unmistakable. The latter's reality principle, resignified through the present analysis, rediscovers in cloning the conflict between the death of the subject, the death that belongs to the subject as subject, and the death drive that undoes the subject, aiming to reach before it, before its human constitution, before its animal and organic constitution, before everything. The death drive discovers in cloning the possibility of undoing sexuation, regressing through the most advanced technology to a form of sissiparity in which the self reproduces its identity interminably, bypassing the vicissitudes of procreation, while at the same time bypassing altogether the subject and its aleatory freedom in the service of a matrix called code. Genetic program codes, genetic and program codes are aligned. Perhaps Plato already determined the task of philosophy as melete thanatu, a study of death, but Freud was the first to undertake this study at both the psychosocial as well as the bioorganic levels. In his exploration of the reality principle, the function of which we have established as the economization of the pleasure principle, he stumbles upon the compulsion to repeat, which seems to contravene and overpower the drive for pleasure. Much about what one calls destiny seems suddenly to hinge on the unconscious fulfillment of this compulsion to repeat. Freud proceeds to identify two aspects in the development of this compulsion, which we can understand as stages, the latter drawing on and reinforcing the former. So at first, the child, just like the adult later, repeats the unpleasurable experience in order to exercise a certain mastery over it. By repeating, the child is no longer the passive recipient, but rather becomes the active director of experience, at least in part, for what repetition presupposes is the redoubling of the self, a replication in which the cloning self controls the suffering of the cloned self. Repeated experience of repetition establishes in turn the latter as something in itself desirable and even pleasant, so that, for example, re-experiencing in itself becomes a source of pleasure. Thus, repetition gains its autonomous significance in the psychic apparatus. Freud wants to pursue the origin of this autonomy into what we might term the organic, pre-psychic, but for Freud, this also already means psychic constitution of life. Freud is now able to generalize the function of repetition by discovering an instinct inherent in organic life to restore an earlier state of things which the living entity has been obliged to abandon under the pressure of external disturbing forces. That is, it is a kind of organic elasticity, or to put it another way, the expression of inertia inherent in organic life. The compulsion to repeat is thus driven by the psychoorganic inertia of life. Accordingly, instincts emerge no longer as forces of change, but as conservative, stabilizing forces. An ancient metaphysical doctrine re-emerges in Freud. Everything living dies for internal reasons. Here, the principle of internal reason is the wish to undo an inflicted transformation, to return ultimately to the inorganic, to non-life. Thus, Freud finds himself compelled to claim that the aim of all life is death, the death drive. At the dawn of life, as soon as the caesura of the organic found itself confronted with the liquid, mineral world whence it had emerged, this drive could easily be fulfilled. Life was brief, death was cheap, and the passage of the inorganic happened for those protocells like it still does among protozoa and bacteria, incessantly, by the million. As life evolved its structures, the drive did not disappear. It evolved with life. Self-preservation self-assertion and mastery became the instincts that life developed in the service of the death drive, the aim always remaining that the organism does not succumb to external forces, but rather follows its own path to death, its own interior law of a return to the inorganic. The organism wishes to die only in its own fashion, says Freud, and this self-fashioning of death, resonating throughout Occidental metaphysics, troubles us today more than ever. Freud, in the process of questioning the primordiality of the death drive, will test a hypothesis that traces back in full the circle of our exploration. Looking into germ cell research of his day, he is confronted with the potential immortality of the protista. Since in unicellular organisms, the individual and the reproductive cell are still one and the same, replication replicates itself as well as its replicating power. In doing so, it seems to preserve an interminably propagating self, the individuality of which coincides with a species, with no distinction between original and copy. Barring corruption of the genetic coding in the process of replication, this self-species has attained immortality. Of course, biology is subject to the inescapable reality of corruption, and it is this reality that the hyperreal claims to have abolished by perfecting the replicability of the real. The origin, imagined, conjured, or vanished, remains important. If life established itself as a series of almost perfectly replicable self-species, the regressive nostalgia of recovering this possibility would seem ineradicable. If the protista were immortal, death would be a late event of organic life. Death would then have emerged as a decay of the soma in the service of the germ cell, which would be able to ensure the immortality of its genetic code. This is what Dawkins has done, by the way. Finally, should life have constituted itself from the outset as deathless, a death drive would be meaningless. Freud, rather than making the mortal soma a late addition of life, prefers to see in the protista the co-presence of the soma and the germ, the mortal and the immortal. Accordingly, the death drive is given an originary, albeit unarticulated place in the formation of life. Moreover, Freud draws heavily on observation of conjugation in protista, that is, the coalescence of two individuals which separate soon afterwards without any subsequent cell division occurring, whereby conjugation has a strengthening and rejuvenating effect upon both of them. In this picture, a sexless life compensates the death drive of the self-species, which left to itself would aim to corrupt itself unto the inorganic. A process, as we have seen, destined to fail and producing instead in its failure, as is well known, biological evolution. In that sense, the function of conjugation appears as the deferral of the fulfillment of the death drive, its Smithian katekon. Accordingly, eros, as the drive of conjugation, economizes thanatos, allowing the death drive to continue operating ad infinitum. For the death drive is a death drive that wills its own dissolution, a drive that runs up against itself. Eros protects this drive from itself. Eros safeguards thanatos. In the above, links and lines of co-implication begin to emerge. Accordingly, the death drive appears as coextensive with the resignified notion of reality. Insofar as its fulfillment, evangelized by hyperreality, is tantamount to the disappearance of reality. Where there is no death drive, and thus no more death, there is no reality. In turn, it becomes clear that the economization of the pleasure principle by the reality principle runs full circle insofar as eros enables thanatos to continue its work. The pleasure principle redoubles upon itself, economizing the reality principle. That was the circuit of reality, a circuit that Baudrillard believes has now been cut open and thus dissolved into a new totality, the hyperreal. Is the passing of the historical contingency of reality irrevocable, irreparable, irremediable? We hear Baudrillard, and I'm coming to a conclusion. This supreme ruse of the system, that of the simulacrum of its death, through which it maintains us in life by having liquidated through absorption all possible negativity, only a superior ruse can stop. Challenge or imaginary science, only a pataphysics of simulacra can remove us from the system's strategy of simulation and the impasse of death in which it imprisons us. To my best knowledge, aside of the ruse of a series of manifestos, Baudrillard nowhere offers the groundwork of this pataphysics, never establishes the imagination that will release us from the systemic simulation of death. Perhaps this is because within the epistemic and epochal closure in which we find ourselves, the most generous act is a promise one knows one cannot keep, a consolation where there is no hope. Equally, there can be no despair. Pessimism, as we know, is irrelevant. I believe it is here that thinkers as diverse as Timothy Morton and Donna Haraway converge. When the latter defines this strange epoch in which we find ourselves, the Cthulhucene, as a time-place for learning to stay with the trouble of living and dying in responsibility on a damaged earth, she recognizes the proliferation of double binds that inform Morton's anguish over the vast ecological catastrophe we are witnessing, which we cannot escape and for which every solution soon takes the shape of a new problem. This is the era of hyperobjects, objects which operate on uncanny spatio-temporal scales, objects with peculiar properties, ridden with contradictions. Thinking hyperobjects through hyperreality, unanticipated possibilities unravel. For Morton, oil, the liquid which propelled the Industrial Revolution and ultimately hypermodernity, as much as the liquid which turns vibrant ecosystems into pestilential swamps, gives us a sense of the viscosity of all hyperobjects. They stick. Importantly, reality itself sticks. We are trapped in the slick. Morton reminds us of the two pills and the mirror of the matrix. The mirror no longer reflects a reality, exchanging a thing for its simulacrum, but melts and coats the hand that attempts to touch it. It is not merely that reality dissolves, but rather that reality, in the form of viscous hyperobjects, now envelopes us as a film of oil. The viscous hyperobjective reality is as pervasive and totalizing as Baudrillard's hyperreality. Baudrillard uses the same image even. The hand passes through the hologram without resistance, but not without consequences. The hand becomes now unreal. Hyperreality has stuck to it. So if Morton is never accused with the charges of pessimism so familiar to Baudrillard, it might not only be that his diagnosis is today unquestionable, but more importantly that Morton harbors no nostalgia, almost no memory, as well as no hope of scrubbing away the petrol reality of our wings. We might no longer fly, perhaps we never did. More importantly, we have to learn to live with a miasma. That means we must try to discover new possibilities, to imagine what lies beyond imagination. Since the collapse of the distinction of reality and hyperreality appears irreversible, hyperobjects can offer us a way of transforming this double, indissoluble plane of the real hyperreal in unforeseen ways. Like Einstein's and Planck's objects, the existence of hyperobjects is interwoven with the fabric of the real. Their changes are changes to the matrix of the real. If for Baudrillard hyperreal objects to no longer resemble anything except the empty figure of resemblance, the empty form of representation, if that is, hyperreal objects are nothing but desolate, if not shattered mirrors, Morton's hyperobjects are liquid mirrors in the process of transformation. What they reflect are partial objects and larval subjects. No reality, no form, only formations, only becomings. Perhaps then, another death is possible and another eros. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgios. Are there any questions from the room?
Thanks a lot. This was wonderful. I'm trying to think in my talk I was very fascinated by this line, please make way for an instant such that the pleasure lover, the pleasure seeker can find his way. a lot of what you are developing is around the pleasure as a principle and the drive that pushes it. What would change to the liquid mirrors if pleasure would be something that needs to be sought and for which there is no drive that directs it? What would happen then to the play you set up?
Yeah, that is good. I can only speak quasi-intuitively, therefore maybe I'm already speaking within a drive, but I fear that within this framework it probably would mean that you would revert back to processes of hyperrealization and simulation. So if you had to think it out, you would end up calculating it again. And that in a way, pleasure offers something that it kind of, if you like, breaks this chain of calculability. Now, I'm not sure that that pleasure and drive have to be directly coupled. I understand that this is a traditional sort of way of thinking about it, and also but I do think that we might be able to conceive of pleasure outside of a drive, and that might afford some solution. But further to that, I do think that your idea is definitely worth exploring. It's not a question that I have by any means settled. I just think that, if anything, I might return the question to you. Do you see that as a possibility?
Yeah, I don't like the idea of the fluid mirrors.
Of what?
Of the fluid mirrors.
Yeah.
So if at all, then I would be interested in the quasi-crystallizations within the nature of fluid mirroricity, or something like that. So, and then the question remains, and it's always the same question: what if we are So I don't like to. It's this other passage of Alberti that I liked so much, where patience is the daughter of necessity. Yeah. No, and then resists, but doesn't resist. So she wants. So necessity is to interpret what is written on this big promise. No, but then it doesn't happen that it can be explained. So there is a generational kind of cyclicity which is not a continuity. That's what I like a lot, and that's why I don't like the fluidity of mirrors. No, there is a real continuity then, which to me is very horrible as an idea.
Well, to put it this way, first of all, fluidity tends to diminish the mirroring effect, right? So, I mean, it's much better to reflect yourself in a lake than in a river. It's very hard. There's hardly any reflection in a river, and a lake is already too liquid for reflection. So a liquid mirror sort of kind of destroys the mirroring effect in principle. Having said that, I also want to say that I wouldn't want to be playing the biological, if you like, against the digital or against the rational. This is not my idea. And also, I don't want to play the unconscious. I don't think that it's a choice over the two. I actually want to claim a space that doesn't exactly belong to either biology or psychoanalysis, or but still kind of offers us a way out of the totality of simulation and the totality of. But this is sort of a work in progress in that sense.
Thanks for the very dense and interesting talk. I was wondering if we could say that the struggle that somehow you put forward in it, and the struggle that I see in your title so far, is one of a conflation between what stands above and what stands before. So between, as you were saying, hyper as a super, and between reality principles, or what stands as an arche as before? And if so, if these hyperobjects that you're pointing to stand in this space in between, so if I recall again this gnomonic circle, if they stand on the oblique, so on the objects, again?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, now, first of all, I don't think that the reality principle as such just comes before, so to say. I mean, at least in Freud's analysis, you sort of stumble onto the reality principle. I mean, the reality principle, if anything, comes as the Epimethean realization that if you continue with pleasure, you collapse. You know, there is no, pleasure cannot sustain itself. I mean, thinking of pleasure also as the absence of pain. So the pleasure principle doesn't come first as the origin of this logic. But you're right, because traditionally the notion of the hyper designates both the origin in terms of in ontological terms, but also in, if you like, epistemological power terms and so on, right? Now, to the second part of your question, so you said whether can you?
Yes. So the way I was visualizing it is again in this gnomonic circle that we were seeing yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
So the reality would say on the horizontal, so it's the rest, what moves horizontally.
Yeah.
And then the hyper would be what goes above, so what goes on this imaginary line, and what stands above. Yeah. And then the hyper object would stand in the translation between the two somehow, or in a domain in between.
Yeah, you're right. Well, yeah, I mean, Morton doesn't have that. He doesn't have any notion of verticality where the hyper objects are in any case transcendent or transcendental even. We dwell amidst them. So hyper objects are very strange indeed. Objects they can take form of, if you like, familiar objects, but they can be the whole, let's say, railway system or an ecology or and so on. So. We find ourselves, the thing is we normally have the subject and then the object is what confronts the subject, like there's a kind of critical distance between the subject and the object, but this is what is abolished with the hyperobject because the subject is already within the object in ways that it's actually hard to even to have the epistemological relation, like it takes, as we've heard the previous days, computational systems, convergence of data sets and so on to actually even realize we're in those objects.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks. This might follow on from that. Just, I was really fascinated that you brought together Haraway's Thulacene and thinking about her system of, critique of self-defining systems and Baudrillard's. But I just wonder if could you say a few more words on that, on how you're thinking to develop this kind of reading together, this nice juxtaposition?
I think you sort of find me a little bit underprepared on that. I mean, also Haraway proposes the Cthulhucene as an alternative notion to, for example, the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, the Plantainocene, and other modes of exploitation, depending on where you want to put the cut-off point. And for her, the Cthulhucene refers to the kind of god Cthulhu and the subterranean forces that she wants to sort of utilize, so that we connect to the earth. It's interesting, those kind of themes that resonate, all the things that are bad about Heidegger, but are now reframed. But yeah, there's this notion of connecting with the earth as well, we might say as a hyperobject, indeed. So I really. But I find my connection, the most important thing that I wanted to draw out here is the significance of how there is no ready solution, how to tarry with the problem is the only way out. So for example, we need to understand that we're not going to have a declining population, if that is important, for the next 30 years at the very least. Now, if we take decisions now to see how we will not continue increasing the population, we will not see how this is going to happen for 30 years. So it's not as though we can say, okay, we found the solutions and things are right, but we have to learn to live differently with solutions that are, if you like, transitory, that are not satisfactory, and so on. And I think that's something, again, she shares with Morton, and I think with a number of other people, if you see what I mean. So partial solutions.
Yeah, no, I was wondering how you were reading that with the system or anti-system that Baudrillard's setting up. Through the, I heard quite a bit of Bataille there as well.
Yeah, well, again, I would say that in some ways, Haraway has a much stronger sense of reality. Huh? and yeah, there is an earth. That's important. Sorry, can you speak up, please? Sorry.
Hello?
Yes.
I was struck by the idea of liquid mirrors too.
Yes.
And I was wondering if we could imagine a connection to the Lacanian notion of the gaze, if there would be something like a hypergaze, or if we could understand what you're proposing as a form of a hypergaze.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Straightforwardly, I have no answer. Like, I'm not Lacanian, so I cannot address that properly. I can only say that the important thing is how in this liquidation of mirrors there is no mastery over the subject that looks and the subject that is being looked exerts no mastery over itself, and I think in this conjunction there might be some other possibilities worth exploring. The notions of blindness that are sort of inherent within the gaze. They're not Lacanian, so I'm sort of drifting this away. But I think there are specific things to keep in mind. Let's not also keep the whole kind of notion of aspect, the respect that is also a spectre, so the sense in which the gaze produces a spectrality. That was something I wanted to bring out. I think we would need to see in the liquid mirror a gaze that is itself also liquidated. But what exactly that would mean for Lacan, maybe you can tell me more during